Buenos días con todos. Es un gusto darle la
Good
bienvenida,
morning,
darles la
everyone.
bienvenida.
It's a
Soy
pleasure
Carla
to
Sáenz,
welcome
asesora
you.
regional de
My name
bioética
is
de la
Carla
OPS.
Sáenz, Regional
Antes de
Bioethics
iniciar
Advisor
propiamente
for
la
PAHO.
sesión,
And before
quiero
we begin
asegurarme
today's
que
session,
todos
I would like
saben
to
cómo
make sure
acceder a la
that
traducción,
everyone knows
porque
how to
tendremos
access
sesiones, tenemos
interpretation
presentaciones en
because we're
español
going
y
to
en
be
inglés.
listening to
Por
presentations both
favor,
in
si
English
quieren
and in
escuchar la
Spanish.
traducción en
If you want
español,
to listen the
vayan
interpretation
al
into
globo
Spanish, please go to
que
the
dice
globe
interpretación
icon that
y
says
luego
interpretation.
aprieten
Click there
en el idioma en el que
and then
quieren
select
escuchar la
your
presentación.
preferred
Si
language.
no les apareciera el globo,
If you do not see the
vayan
globe,
al,
you need to
círculo que dice más y
click on
aprieten
the
los tres
three dots
puntitos y
that
les aparecerá el
says
globo.
more, and then you will see the
Dear
globe.
colleagues, please, I want to make sure you have access to the interpretation. If you want to listen to this session in English, click on the little globe that says interpretation and then click on English if that's the language in which you want to listen to the session. Nuevamente ahora, bienvenidos a
So
esta
once
segunda
again,
sesión
welcome to
de
this
nuestra serie
second
de
session
seminarios
of our
virtuales
series
sobre
of
temas
webinars
relacionados con
on
desarrollo
topics
clínico.
related to clinical
Este es
trials.
el segundo seminario
This is the
y
second
esta
seminar,
sesión, esta serie está
and
coorganizada
this
por el Programa
series is
Regional de Bioética
co-organized by
de la
the
OPS,
Regional
que hace parte del
Bioethics
Departamento de
Committee at
Evidencia
PAHO, which
e
is part of the
Inteligencia para la
Evidence
Acción en Salud,
and
y la
Intelligence
Unidad de
for
Calidad y
Action in Health,
Regulación de
and the
Medicamentos y
Quality
Tecnologías
and
Sanitarias de la
Health
organización,
Medicine
que hace parte
and
del
Devices
Departamento de
Regulations
Innovación,
at the
Acceso a
organization, which is
Medicamentos
part
y
of the
Tecnologías
Innovation
Sanitarias.
Access to Medicines and Health
Ah,
Technologies
Antes
at
que
PAHO.
nada, quiero
Before we begin,
invitarlos a revisar la
I would
página
like
web del
to
Programa
invite you
Regional
to
de
check
Bioética
the
de la
website
OPS,
of our
donde
bioethics
podrán ver la
webpage,
grabación de la
where you
primera
will be
sesión
able
por si
to
no hubieran tenido
watch the
oportunidad de
recording
participar
from our first
y
session in case
además
you were not able to
suscribirse a
participate,
nuestra
and
lista de
also subscribe
distribución de
to
investigación
our
ética y
mailing
recibir
list
información sobre
on
el siguiente seminario
ethics
que les
research and receive
anticipo se llevará a
information
cabo el
on
30 de
our
agosto
upcoming
y se
seminar,
enfocará
which
en la
will take
revisión
place
de
on
estudios
August 30th
multicéntricos
and will
y la
be
política
focusing
de
on
revisión ética
multi-center
bioética
studies
de los
and the
Estados
review
Unidos,
of
con
the
miras
single
a aprender
policy
sobre esa
in the United States in
experiencia
order to
en nuestra
learn from
región.
that experience in our region.
La sesión de hoy se trata sobre
Today's
los
session
comités
will
de monitoreo de
focus
datos y
on
el
data
rol en la
monitoring
ética.
committees and the
Tendremos
role
dos
that ethics
presentaciones
plays.
seguidas
We will have
de
two
un diálogo
presentations
y para ese
followed
diálogo
by
los
a
invito
discussion.
a
And
enviar
for
sus
that
preguntas
discussion, I would like
usando
to
la
kindly
función de
ask you to
preguntas y
please
respuestas
send
del Zoom.
your
Si
questions
tuvieran
via the
cualquier otro
Q&A
comentario,
icon
quisieran
on Zoom.
compartir
Now, if you have any other comments
algún
or
enlace,
if
lo
you would like
pueden
to
enviar
share
por
a
medio del chat.
link,
Y
you
en
can do
ambos casos,
so by
tanto para las
using the
preguntas
chat
como
function.
para
And both for
compartir
questions
información en el
and
chat,
to share
pueden
information on
enviarlas
the
en
chat,
español o en
you
inglés.
can do so in
Hoy
either
día para
English
las
or Spanish.
presentaciones nos
Today,
acompaña la doctora
for our
Patricia Saidón.
presentations, we are joined
Ella
by
es
Dr.
médico
Patricia Saidon,
neurólogo
who is a
y es consultora
neurologist
internacional
and
de la
is
Unidad de
also
Calidad de
an
Regulación de
international
Medicamentos y
consultant for
Tecnologías
the
Sanitarias de
Health
la OPS.
Technologies and
Ella ha
Medicines
sido
Unit
jefa de
at
ensayos clínicos
PAHO.
de la
She led
Administración
clinical
Nacional de
trials at the
Medicamentos, Alimentos y
international
Tecnología Médica, la ADMAT de
the
Argentina,
ANMAT in
y ha
Argentina, the
sido también
Administration for
coordinadora del
National
grupo de
Medicines and
buenas prácticas
Technology, and she
clínicas
also
de la
coordinated the
red
group of
PAHO, la red
good
de
medical or clinical
autoridades
rather practices
regulatorias.
at the
Nos
Pander
acompaña también
region.
la
We are
doctora
also
Sima Shah.
joined by Dr.
Ella
Seema
es
Shah,
bioeticista
who
con
is a
formación en Derecho,
bioethicist with
es
a
profesora de
degree in law.
pediatría de la Escuela de
She's
Medicina del
also
Northwestern
a professor on
University
pediatrics
y
at the
Founders Board Professor
university, and she's a Founders
de
Board
Ética Médica
professor
del Hospital
on
de Niños
medical
Lurie en
ethics
Chicago.
at the Lurie
La
Children's Hospital
profesora
in
Shah es
Chicago.
directora de Ética
Professor
Médica de
Shah is
Investigación
a
y dirige el programa de
professor
ética
on
de la
ethics, and she
investigación
leads
pediátrica de este mismo
pediatric
hospital.
ethics,
Su
the
investigación se
pediatrics
enfoca
ethics
en
unit at
temas
the
de
hospital. Her
ética
research
en investigación
focuses
global,
on
en temas
global
de ética de
research
investigación
ethics,
pediátrica,
pediatric
y
research
esto
ethics,
incluye
and
temas
this
inclusive
includes
regulatorios
ethics
en
and
la,
regulatory
en la
issues.
estoy tratando de recordar el término de
I'm trying to remember the
control
term.
human infection studies, disculpen
On
que no me
control
sale
human
en
infection
español,
studies.
solo
I'm
estoy
sorry,
tratando
I
de la
can't
versión
think
traducida en español
of
más
it
apropiada
in
de
English.
OPS,
even though PAHO provided the Spanish translation, as well as pandemic preparedness from the pediatric point of view. So without further ado, first of all, thank you, Dr. Shah, and thank you, Dr. Saidon, for joining us today. And without further ado, then, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Saidon. Go ahead.
Perdón, Patricia, está sin volumen.
Patricia, you are muted.
Patricia, ¿puedes abrir tu micro?
Patricia,
Ahora
could
me
you
escuchan
please
todos.
turn your mic on?
Perfecto,
Can you hear me now?
Perfecto.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Perdón.
Apologies for
muchas
that.
gracias, Carla.
Well,
Entonces,
thank you
yo
so
me voy a
much,
referir
Carla,
desde el
and
punto
I
de
will
vista regulatorio a
talk
los
from the
comités
regulatory
de
point of view
monitoreo de
about data
Patricia,
monitoring
más bien, ya no
committees.
estamos viendo tu presentación. Ahí va.
Patricia, we no
Perfecto,
longer see your
perfecto.
Oh,
datos.
there you go.
Mi
Thank you.
presentación.
Now you're going to see my presentation.
¿Todos ven bien la presentación?
Can everybody see my presentation?
Perfecto, ya se corrieron las
Yes.
cortinas para todos.
The
Bueno, muy
curtains
bien.
have been
Entonces
drawn.
vamos a referirnos a los
Okay,
comités
so
de
I'm going
monitoreo
to
de
talk
datos.
about data
En este
monitoring
caso yo voy
committees
a
or
hablar
DMCs,
más desde el punto de
and I'm
vista
going to be
regulatorio.
focusing more on the
Y
regulatory
lo
aspect
primero
of
que
this.
vamos a hacer
So the
es
first thing I'm
hablar
going to do
entonces de la definición de,
is
de
to
los
talk
comités de
about
monitoreo de datos.
a
Después vamos
DMC
a ver cuándo
definition.
se requieren
And then
estos
we're
comités.
going to see when
Vamos a
these
hablar de
committees
qué
are
tipo de
needed.
procedimientos
I'm
tienen que
also
tener
going to talk
y
about what kind
cuáles
of
son sus
procedures they may have in
responsabilidades.
place, as well as what their responsibilities are.
Entonces, un comité de monitoreo de
So,
datos
a
es
data
un grupo
monitoring committee
independiente del
is an
patrocinador
independent
que está
group,
formado
independent from the
por
sponsor that
expertos
is made up
externos
by external
a un
experts,
estudio clínico.
and that is
Y su
external to a
función
clinical
principal es
study.
supervisar
Their
la
main role
seguridad
is
de los
to
pacientes y
monitor
los datos de eficacia
patient
del tratamiento mientras el
safety
ensayo
and
está en
efficacy
curso.
data for treatment
Tiene un
while
rol
the
único
trial
en
is
investigación
ongoing.
clínica,
It
porque
plays
es un
a unique
comité
role in
que
clinical research
puede
because
revisar
this
los
committee
datos
is able
de
to review data
acumulados de seguridad
that
y
have
de
been gathered
eficacia,
around
pero
both
de manera
safety
no
and
ciega.
efficacy,
Y esto le
but
otorga
in a
un rol
non-blinded
fundamental
way,
en
which
la
gives it
supervisión
a key
de la
role
investigación
in
clínica.
monitoring or
Vamos a
overseeing
hacer un poco
clinical
de historia.
research. So
Hacia
now a little bit of history.
1990, los
Back in
comités de monitoreo de
1990,
datos actuaban más
see
cuando había
DMCs
estudios con condiciones de
were
enorme
brought in
mortalidad
where there were
elevada
high
o
morbidity
cuando había
mortality
métodos estadísticos más sofisticados
studies,
para
or
realizar
when more
análisis
sophisticated
intermedios y
statistical
controlar
methods were
falsos
used
positivos.
for
Y
intermediate
estaban
analysis
ya
and
presentes en
to
la guía
check for
ICH-E9,
false
se
positives.
hablaba de
And
estos comités.
we, in the
Posteriormente comenzaron
ICH-E9
a tener
guideline, there was already
mayor
mention of these committees.
rol, o sea, abarcar
Later
más
on, they started
cuestiones en investigación clínica. Se
uh,
agregaron, por
addressing
ejemplo, las
more
enfermedades
aspects. For
raras,
example, they started
se
focusing on
agregaron
rare diseases,
estudios en donde hubiera
as well as
poblaciones
studies where there
particulares,
were
oncología,
specific
los estudios de
populations,
fase
oncology,
temprana,
early
o
stage
métodos
studies,
estadísticos
or
sofisticados
statistical
también, pero
methods that were more sophisticated
con, por ejemplo, los estudios adaptativos.
with,
Si
for
ustedes
example,
ven a partir
adaptive
del
studies.
2006
Now,
hasta
starting
la
in
fecha,
2006
clinical
to now,
trial, por
in
ejemplo,
clinicaltrial.gov, for
muchísimos
example,
van,
a lot of
se
studies,
incrementó muchísimo
or
el
rather,
número de
there was a great
comités de
increase
monitoreo
in
de
the
datos en los
number of
estudios
DMCs
y hay algunas
present
cuestiones
in
que
studies.
cambiaron. Por ejemplo,
And some
el
aspects
comité
have
de
changed.
monitoreo de
For
datos
example,
muchas veces pasó
the
de
DMC oftentimes
actuar en un solo
went
estudio
from
a
being
actuar en
involved in
todo
a
el
single
desarrollo de
in a
un
single
producto.
study to becoming involved in the entire development
Hay
of
muchos
a given
comités
product.
que tienen
Now,
alguna tarea
there are
de
a lot of
supervisión en los
committees
ensayos
that have
clínicos.
some sort of
Uno
oversight
es el comité
role
de
in
ética.
clinical trials. One is the
Otro
ethics
es el
committee,
comité de monitoreo de datos.
or IRB.
Otros
Then
son
we
los
have
comités
the data
ejecutivos o
monitoring
steering
committee.
committees
Then
en
we
inglés,
have the
¿eh?
steering
Y otros son los
committees, or
comités de
SCs,
adjudicación del
and then
punto final.
we have the
Las
final
tareas de
point
cada
award,
uno son
the
muy
final
diferentes.
award committees.
Bueno,
And they each
vamos
play a different role. And today we're going to focus specifically on ethics and data monitoring committees. Here you are all familiar with the primary role that IRBs play, or ethics committees, and we're going to talk about the other three. The DMC, or Data Monitoring Committee, assesses progress, specifically safety data, but also critical efficacy points, and based on the review of those data, they make a recommendation to the sponsor. And they're different from the steering committee, or SC, which assesses the scientific validity of the protocol. They also monitor for quality of the study. They also work on the scientific quality of the final report. They also see if the number of events are reached for final point, and then whether there's a dropout of patients and whether that has any impact on the study. And it's different from the final point of work committee, which harmonizes and standardizes the final point. For example, if it's a radiological point, then they standardize that all events are similar, that they are standardized and they are similar. Now, when do we need a DMC? In order to decide whether or not we need a DMC, we need to take into account what the study calls for, what the endpoints for the study are, how long the trial lasts, because we need to take into account that a DMC will be involved in longer studies versus short ones. Also, what the study population is. So, here we have some examples. One example is life-threatening disease, or studies, or when there's mortality or morbidity or mortality potential for rare diseases, and when they want to extend life. Also in the studies whose data may justify early termination of the study, for example, for safety reasons, and also in studies where the patient population is made of newborns, pregnant women, or pediatric population, the elderly. So there are different types of population that may warrant having a DMC. Also, studies in emergency situations, for example, with deferred consent, studies also in early phases, for example, in phase 2, where the dose to be used has to be determined, or where we have limited safety information. Also, studies with high-risk interventions, for example, some immunotherapy products or oncology drugs, etc. Or in cases where an event may happen to impact a certain portion of the population. For example, if there's an acute myocardial infarction among the elderly, then the committee can see if there's a specific point here that needs to be addressed. And not so much when there's a single event, for example, a Stevens-Johnson syndrome or others, because that is reviewed by the pharmacovigilance internal committee from the sponsor. But if there is an event that could be anticipated in a certain population, then they come in so that we do not expose that population to that event. Also, when there are situations that may warrant establishing a DMC, for example, studies that require pre-planned intermediate analysis that could lead to stopping the study early, either because it's deemed futile or because there's a very high efficacy of the product, or in the design of complex studies where we want to potentially modify the study design based on intermediate unmasked data. We also need to take into account that there may be recommendations on operational aspects based on non-comparative safety and efficacy cumulative data. For example, the committee may decide they when they have results lower than expected or when the dropout rate is higher than expected. So the first thing we need to take into account is that a data monitoring committee that is well established must be ready to identify the unexpected, and it must also be prepared to mitigate risks that could impact the safety of the study subject or the quality of the data and or integrity of the trial. So these are the highlights of what we need to take into account when we decide whether or not to develop and establish a DMC. Now, in terms of the committee members, they are chosen by the sponsor. If there is a steering committee, then the SC chooses them. And in terms of the aspect to take into account, it has to do with the composition or makeup, qualification of the members, and data on independence of the members. So taking into account that the makeup or composition must enable the committee to identify unexpected issues or mitigate risk and or intervene in data quality issues, it has to be multidisciplinary. That we need to have among the members doctors with knowledge of the pathology. We need to have biostatisticians. If there is a high risk potential, we need to have members to take into account ethics aspect, and we also need to have members with the background on IT or other technical aspects. Now, it is important for members to have a relevant scientific experience. They also must have hands-on experience and need to know about clinical trials and how they're carried out. It is also important to have some members to have experience in other data monitoring committees. They need to have a good understanding of the issues as well as the limitations of clinical trials. At least the chair must have previous committee experience. This is very important. And in terms of independence, members may not have any kind of financial stakes or other conflicts of interest. For example, that they may not have any conflicts with later authorship issues, or if a member of a DMC is also part of a clinical trial in the same area but with a different sponsor, this may also constitute conflict of interests. Data monitoring committees must have procedures in place before the clinical trial starts. They must describe how to ensure the clinical study integrity in terms of whether we disseminate non-masked data about the study. They must have procedures to ensure that the integrity of the clinical trial will not be compromised by discussing or disseminating that unredacted information. And they also must have procedures in terms of what their responsibilities are, how they're going to be made up, what the selection criteria are, what's the role of the chair, what the role of voting and non-voting members are. For example, we may have a biostatistician that's part of the committee with voting rights, but sometimes DMCs also have statistics members that do not have a right to vote. So we need to have a clear definition of the roles and responsibilities of each. We also need to know what the procedure is for new appointments and removal, how conflicts of interest are resolved, how they're going to be meeting, whether meetings will be open or closed. For example, committee meetings are going to be closed, but if they have to meet with the steering committee to address a specific aspect, then those meetings may be open. Then how quorum would be accounted for, what the format of the meetings is going to be, the amount of data that will be analyzed, and what the data flow would be like so that the committee may analyze it and make recommendations. Also, how data confidentiality will be ensured. And it is important to know that the committee gives recommendations, but they don't have a later role in reconfiguring the trial. So a recommendation may be to modify the trial, but they will not actually modify or change the trial. So we need to clearly state that they make the recommendation, but not actually implement it. Also, the timing for implementing recommendations, and also how meetings are going to be conducted. Now, DMCs specifically will review safety data. They will also implement a specific adaptive function, for example, data on efficacy, futility, or others. For example, if the sample size is correct or it needs to be expanded, or whether a certain aspect has to be changed for a certain reason. Also, aspects that may impact the quality of the study. For example, if we see that, or if they see that there are not enough events that may be considered an endpoint, then changes need to be made. And then based on all this, the DMC makes recommendations. Now, in terms of safety, the most common and widely acknowledged purpose is to oversee clinical trials in terms of the study safety. We need to take into account that in clinical trials where what is being researched may cause morbidity or mortality, there will be an impact on the primary efficacy endpoint that will have some sort of impact on safety if the group that receives that product has a lower response than the control group. But for example, we can see they can also review the comparison between adverse event rates between the group that is receiving the drug and the control group, and they need to see whether there's a difference in those rates. And a third important aspect regarding safety is considering serious individual events. For example, as a result of one individual serious event, they can request a change in selection criteria, termination, dose change, etc. Now, in terms of efficacy, we can also look at whether there's a difference in efficacy between different groups. These efficacy differences may be so high for the study group that may result in a recommendation, but it may also be a result of the futility of the product being studied. So the DMC needs to prevent or avoid inflating type 1 errors. So bioethicists have a key role in this. Now, in adaptive studies, like we said, they may recommend a specific change or adaptation. And then what happens when we have external data, that is to say, from a different study on the same product or on drugs that have the same pharmacological makeup that may become critical information? Well, in that case, the data monitoring committee make a recommendation to the sponsor about the data that may not be coming from the study itself, but rather external data that may compromise the risk-benefit ratio. And also, regulatory agencies may ask the sponsor that a specific analysis be done on certain aspects raised by the DMC. So, based on this, the committee, like we said, makes recommendations. After they review all of this, then they make recommendations. For example, to continue with the study because there are no data that may point to any kind of necessary modification or termination. Another recommendation could be termination, whether it's due to futility or because one branch is very different or because safety issues have been raised which warrant terminating this study. Also, temporary suspension to better assess a specific event, for example. And finally, changes, whether it's with the areas of the study, the sample size, or any point in the design. So basically, all of this is what I wanted to share with you in terms of regulatory aspects and DMCs. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you, Patricia. I see we have a lot of questions already, but we're going to take all questions at the end after listening to Dr. Shah's presentation because we will continue talking about this. So go ahead, Sima.
Gracias, Carla. Buenos días a todos. Ojalá pudiera
Carla.
hablar
Good
con
morning,
ustedes
everyone.
en español.
I would really
Necesito
like
que
to
practicar más.
speak to you in Spanish, but I'm going to have to practice my Spanish a little more. So
let's proceed to discuss ethical considerations for data monitoring committees. I'm very glad to present some of the work that I've been doing with a team of people to try and address this issue, as I think it's really been neglected for some time. So this is our team. We have Dorcas Kumuya has been leading our work in Kenya with Alex Hinga, and they have both been instrumental in carrying forward some of the qualitative work I'll be presenting to you. You can see our Lurie Children's site based in Chicago. We have several members here and other team members around the world. So today what I'd like to do is begin by first speaking about giving you some background on data monitoring committee ethics. I am grateful for the presentation by Doctora Saidon, because I think that really provided a lot of key information, but I'll supplement to some degree to focus a little bit more on ethics. Next, I will talk about some qualitative data that we have developed on data monitoring committee ethics from talking to people who've served on data monitoring committees all around the world. And finally, I will provide a preliminary framework for data monitoring committee ethics. And this is work that is very preliminary in the sense that I haven't even published it to an external audience. So I am eager for your feedback. So as you've heard, data monitoring committees include statisticians, clinicians, and sometimes ethicists to oversee ongoing trials. And they typically have exclusive access to unblinded data. And this really has started to be of increased interest to the media, especially during the COVID pandemic. This article was really focused on how secretive data monitoring committees are and how little was known about them prior to the pandemic by most people. We've heard already about how these committees make recommendations to sponsors, and then these recommendations are not enforceable just by the data monitoring committees. The sponsors have to decide what to do with the recommendations. During the COVID pandemic, the value of data monitoring committees became very clear to everyone, particularly with the oversight of vaccine trials. And this article, this was a commentary on an article from the COVID-19 Vaccine Data and Safety Monitoring Board, which is another name for data monitoring committees. And in this article, Larry Corey argued that never have so many of us in investigative medicine owed so much to so few. And it really was, if you have a chance to read about what this committee did, it's really impressive how much time, effort, and energy was spent overseeing the clinical trials and ensuring that the data would be of high enough quality for so many of us to receive vaccinations afterwards. A key component of data monitoring committees is that they're inherently doing ethical work. And I think this isn't always realized, but has been realized by many people who are who have been on data monitoring committees for years and have experienced the challenges firsthand. So David Demetz and Susan Ellenberg actually argued that this monitoring is motivated primarily by an ethical imperative. And what makes it complicated is that this ethical judgment that DMCs have to exercise is really intertwined with the statistical and practical decisions that they're making. It's hard to separate all of these things. They really come together. As these authors argued, the decision to prematurely stop a blinded, randomized, controlled clinical trial can be extremely complicated, involving a tangle of ethical, statistical, and practical issues. We've heard a bit about how data monitoring committees relate to research ethics committees, or IRBs, as we refer to them in the US. But one key component to note is that data monitoring committees are these sole people who are supposed to look at unblinded data for randomized controlled trials, and IRBs don't have that access. Another component is that IRBs are really disconnected in some ways from the trial steering committee and really part of an institution, whereas DMCs are appointed by the sponsors of the trials. And this is, I think, important to think about, important to have as background or to underscore as we talk about the ethical duties of DMCs. Some other key differences between these two groups are that research ethics committees, as I think you all know quite well, review and approve protocols from trials before they start. But data monitoring committees are looking at this unblinded data as trials are ongoing. Research ethics committees are required by regulation. They're typically set up at institutions or regionally, depending on the country. Data monitoring committees are not necessarily required by regulation. They may be in certain committees and in certain countries, and I'd love to hear more about it from Dr. Saidon later. I think some of you asked questions about this as well. But in the United States, they're sometimes recommended by the Food and Drug Administration, and they are sometimes required by sponsors, like the National Institutes of Health. Research ethics committees often include ethicists, and in our work, we've found that DMCs often do not include ethicists, and this is particularly true when DMCs, it seems to be particularly true when DMCs are run by pharmaceutical companies. There has been, I think, a fair amount of focused attention in bioethics on research ethics committees and what they do, and there's been a lot less bioethics attention on data monitoring committees. Additionally, there's limited ethics guidance for DMCs. So if you look to the literature, as we've been doing for the past few years, there are hundreds of case studies about really challenging decisions that data monitoring committees have made, and several textbooks that have been written by statisticians and clinicians. Additionally, for each trial, protocols will include statistical analysis plans and stopping boundaries that guide decision-making and help make it clear when a trial might be stopped early. Experienced data monitoring committees have to exercise their judgment wisely, and they have a lot of experience. Most of the experienced DMC members, who are often called again and again to serve, have a lot of this experience to draw on, and I think are able to make tough ethical decisions as a result. But unfortunately, there's limited explicit ethical guidance, and this is especially becoming a problem as the use of data monitoring committees are growing. So as newer members need to be recruited to be a part of these trials just to meet the demand, there is not as much information for them in terms of how they should do their job and how they should think about ethics. So in our project, and additionally, I think there's also a lack of empirical data on the experience of DMCs. There's a few studies, but not as many as we would need, and especially not focused on ethics. So our project sought to fill this gap. It was funded by the Greenwell Foundation, and this is the title here. We initially were thinking about really trying to learn from the COVID-19 pandemic to develop ethical guidance for data and safety monitoring committees, or data monitoring committees, as both of these terms are often used, overseeing clinical trials. So first, I'm pleased to present some data from the qualitative interviews we did of data monitoring committee members. And for this study, we used a purposive sampling strategy, trying to achieve diverse representation of people with different expertise, including statisticians, clinicians, and ethicists, but also people from diverse backgrounds. Our inclusion criteria were pretty simple, but unfortunately still, I think, a little too restrictive. So we required that respondents had served on at least one DMC, and they had to be able to participate in an interview in English. We developed and piloted semi-structured interview guides, did these interviews virtually, recorded and transcribed them, and conducted thematic analysis on them. I'm happy to talk more about the methods for anyone who's interested. But what we ended up finding is we had 22 data monitoring committee members. They served a variety of different roles on DMCs, including statisticians, clinicians, ethicists, and researchers, and had different background. There were only a few who had exclusive training in ethics. There were some who had joint training in ethics and statistics or medicine. And then also some people had training in biomedical science. All of them had many years of expertise, at least 10 years of professional expertise. And then we ended up having, although we tried to achieve a diverse global sample, we ended up having people sort of mostly bifurcated between the US and Africa, I think based on where our study teams were located. So I'd like to focus on 5 themes that we identified in conducting this work. First is about, and I think much of this will draw on and sort of give some color to some of the information that you heard already from Dr. Saidon. So first we'll talk about experience and qualifications, then their relationships with research ethics committees, ethics expertise with DMCs, a sort of surprising finding that we had about moral distress within DMCs, and then this challenge that there are many and varied ethical duties that people identify. So first, with regard to their experience and qualifications, one interesting finding was that people sort of perceived this exclusivity about how how they or others were recruited into serving on data monitoring committees. Most people described being recruited from someone they knew. There was one exception of a person who actually applied for a job that had been posted as a member of a data monitoring committee. But for most people, it was that they were just contacted by someone who had met them in some professional context. There was a perception that there's a closed club of people who are invited to serve in these positions. And someone said, I kind of saw the same people popping up for DSMB. There was also an important issue of representation, particularly for global trials. Several people agreed that there was importance in diverse representation, that having people who were serving on a DMC from a host country where a trial was being conducted was integral to understanding the situation, kind of a reality check. There was one example where a local IRB wouldn't let a study go forward because it didn't have a representative from that country. And once such a representative was found, then the trial could proceed. But that was a unique example that we heard about. One person suggested that the US National Institutes of Health is increasingly aware of the importance of having this representation, but that it's impossible to represent all host countries in very large trials. and thought really the region might be something that needs to be represented rather than specific countries. But then people who were serving on DMCs from some countries, particularly low and middle income countries, said that sometimes there was a disconnect in terms of the expertise, and voices of local members were not always heard. So that was one, I think, important challenge that was not fully resolved. A second theme relates to relationships with research ethics committees. And here we found views on a spectrum. So there were some people who thought there should be no relationship between a research ethics committee and a data monitoring committee. Others thought there might be times where there should be an open channel to converse if it was needed. And then one or two people thought there should be lots of interaction, that they should be able to talk whenever it seems important to either party. And a key issue that came up was that the data monitoring committee has to keep data confidential. So the more that they share information with the IRB, the more that they might unblind the IRB and also violate the terms of their contract. One interesting middle ground that someone raised with, I think, a really powerful rationale was they felt that ethics committees should have the right to know who's on the data monitoring committee, because they're turning over a tremendous responsibility to this group of people that they don't know. But they should know that they're capable and qualified of taking care of business. And this came from a statistician. And interestingly, this is consistent with the guidance from the US Food and Drug Administration. As far as we can tell from other work we've done, however, this doesn't always happen. A third theme was about ethics expertise within data monitoring committees. And interestingly, there was differing perceptions of ethicists. One example that really characterized this was that for a lot of people, they didn't necessarily see the value of ethicists until a challenging ethical situation came. So one statistician was talking about a trial where as the trial had started, data emerged from another study in a different place that suggested that the intervention was more harmful than had been realized. So she said, and now we were faced with a real dilemma. What is your responsibility to the participants in the trial and for the outside world? And then she said, and we had one of those pain in the neck ethicists whom I really couldn't stand. And then he was wonderful. He walked us through how to think about these issues in a very systematic way. And it was really, really valuable. So this was, I think, a really important quote to illustrate the challenge of including ethicists and DMCs, but also the potential value of it. With all of our participants, we heard sort of a range of views. There were some who, like the quote you just heard, thought that ethicists could be extremely helpful. This person also noted that sometimes she worried that it was a waste of the time of ethicists because so many issues that came up for data monitoring committees are so technical and not really raising tough ethical questions. But then there would be times when they'd be really needed. But then there were others who said, I think the purpose of a DSMB or data monitoring committee is clear. Yeah, it is not to make ethical decisions. I don't think you want to argue that ethicists should sit on DSMB. I think there are numerous other opportunities for it. So a fourth theme that arose related to a term that may or may not be familiar to all of you, but one that really hasn't, I think, been raised in the context of data monitoring committees very much, and this is moral distress. One prominent definition of moral distress is when one knows the right thing to do, but institutional constraints make it nearly impossible to pursue the right course of action. So to give you some examples of how people talked about this kind of emotion or challenge, one example is where somebody said, there was at least one occasion that I can remember where I felt the decision was absolutely clear that we should stop, and the rest of the DSMB wanted to continue. I literally lost sleep over it. That's the problem when you're on a DSMB, is you never know. What you believe is not necessarily going to carry the day. Similarly, one clinician investigator had a challenge that arose with respect to stopping boundaries. And they said, in general, you should rely on the boundaries as they are laid out in the statistical analysis plan or the other information available to data monitoring committees. But if something comes up and there needs to be a change, then I think that's something that's really gut-wrenching for the DSMB to think about. And this was an interesting finding for us because it was something that isn't really addressed in the ethics literature or in the larger literature about data monitoring committees. There are just a handful of articles that suggest that this kind of challenge might arise from DMCs, even though the job is very technical and in some cases very dry. You're looking at tables of statistical data after all. But one interesting paper that I would encourage you to read was entitled, "You Have to Keep Your Nerve on a DMC." And this was about a neonatal randomized clinical trial where different challenges arose. And part of what the authors were talking about and finding in that study is similarly that there are these challenges about deciding whether a trial should continue, but that one of the important things that data monitoring committees should do is be able to keep a trial going until the data really show a difference that can change clinical practice. We also found that there were many and varied ethical duties. So on this chart, what I want you to notice is simply that we've listed all of the ethical duties here and the people who identified these duties when we asked them about it, and all agreed on the responsibility to monitor safety, as you heard from Dr. Saidon. Many also mentioned the importance of monitoring data quality. There were several other duties that were mentioned, but there was huge variation in how many people mentioned particular duties, and some of them were only mentioned by 1 or 2 people. So now I want to turn to some data that we have not presented externally yet. And this is really an attempt to try and figure out what should the data monitoring committee be thinking about in terms of ethical considerations, and how do we sort of deal with this situation where there are so many different things that they could be doing. How do we make sure that they're doing what they should be doing in a given trial? So we convened an international interdisciplinary workshop with ethicists, statisticians, and clinicians with many years of experience on DMCs. We tried to pull people from all of the WHO member regions, and we were lucky to have Dr. Garacedo with us at this workshop. It was held at the National Institutes of Health's Fogarty International Center on April 8th through 9th, 2024. And our goal was to identify the ethical considerations that data monitoring committees should address. We started, as we were thinking about this, with a key framework that you may have seen before on what makes clinical research ethical. And we felt that from this framework, it needed some modification to apply to data monitoring committees. We weren't sure that given their role so internally to the trial that collaborative partnership made sense for data monitoring committees, but we did think the other benchmarks that have been included in this framework were relevant to data monitoring committees. And then we sort of modified them slightly, as I'll discuss a little bit more these. So when you think about these benchmarks for what makes clinical research ethical, the first is this idea of social value. And social value is, of course, the idea that a trial should have enough value to justify the use of resources, to justify studying this question as opposed to others, and also to to justify the risk to which participants are being exposed. For DMCs, that means that people who serve on DMCs will need to decide whether a trial has enough social value to justify the risk and for them to serve on that trial before they join a data monitoring committee. During the trial, they need to keep track of results from other trials and make sure that there's still value to continuing this one. As they look at data, they have to consider how the data will be interpreted by others if the trial is stopped. And if the data are not conclusive to change clinical practice, it may not make sense to stop trials. Finally, they should stop a trial when the social value is too low to justify continued risk. A second issue is scientific validity. Making sure that trials are scientifically valid is important to ensure that participants are, burdens that they're taking on are taken on in order to produce results that will be useful to the scientific committee. So that includes overseeing data quality and completeness and monitoring that the intervention is being used in the way it's supposed to. A third benchmark is the idea of fair participant selection, that participants should be selected fairly for scientific reasons and not on the basis of vulnerability and privilege. For data monitoring committees, that may require reviewing whether the participants are representative of the target population, monitoring recruitment and retention, and making sure that particular subgroups are not exposed to excessive risk. With respect to a favorable risk-benefit ratio, DMCs have to monitor safety and efficacy to make sure that the risk is continued to be justified. They have to look closely at adverse events to see if they're caused by the study intervention. They also should be thinking about whether placebos are still ethical. In some cases, they may have to think about escalating doses or enrolling new cohorts depending on the design of the trial. Informed consent is also important in terms of determining if participants should stay blinded and if new information should be given to them as the study is ongoing. And then in terms of independent review, for DMCs, they need to identify and address conflicts of interest to ensure independence. They can't share information and need to preserve the blind except in rare circumstances. And then occasionally they may need to communicate with research ethics committees. Finally, respect for participants is something that we thought, especially with respect to trial termination and post-trial, hasn't really been addressed. So it's important to think about determining what to tell participants about their transition to care after a study is over. And it may be important to review how findings are described if they're disseminated in press releases to make sure they're accurate with what the data monitoring committee has seen. Finally, in primary publications, how the DMC's role is described needs to be reviewed by the DMC. And this is something sponsors and researchers will have to take the lead on, but something that we thought is important to have happen. So in conclusion, I think there's this perception that data monitoring committees are insular bodies, and they could benefit from wider recruitment and better global representation. We could benefit from more clear guidance about how much research ethics committees and DMCs should interact. There could be high-profile conflict if there's not clarity on the different duties. We found no agreement about whether ethicists should be involved in DMCs, but we also found examples of hard ethical issues and moral distress, which suggests the need for ethics training. And finally, we think it's important for there to be an ethical framework for data monitoring committees to help ensure that there's appropriate attention to ethical issues that come up across a wide range of trials. And it's challenging to figure out because not all trials will raise the same ethical issues. But we think that with additional attention, there could be greater consistency and agreement about key ethical issues that all trials should address. So I would like to acknowledge the expert advisory panel that helped us with recruitment and so many decisions along the way. And this is our members of our research team who weren't able to be here today, but have really done so much work to put this all together. And then point you to a couple of papers that are coming out from the qualitative data that I presented, and say thank you and turn it over back to you to hear if you have any questions. And I'm really eager to have a dialogue about this work. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Sima. Creo que han sido dos presentaciones sumamente interesantes que nos dan mucho que pensar.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. Actually, both of them were, and they give us a lot of food for thought with regards to these two committees, especially these ecosystems involved in the research ecosystem. Let's move on to some questions. I'm going to introduce Sarah Carracedo, who works at PAHO with the bioethics component. We ask that you submit your questions in whatever language you speak through the chat. We want to make sure we don't lose any of the questions. So let's move on to the
Gracias,
Q&A.
Carla, por la presentación.
Thank
Y
you, Carla,
gracias,
for the
Patricia
presentation.
y
Thank you,
Sima, por
Patricia,
estar hoy día en
for
este seminario.
joining
Hay
us in
varias
this
preguntas,
seminar. There are actually
así que
several questions
empezaré
that
de
have
las
come
más
up.
generales
So let's start off
a
with some
acciones más específicas.
fairly
Y la
encompassing and
primera está relacionada con la
questions.
regulación.
We're starting off
¿Existe
with the
alguna
regulation aspects.
regulación,
Is there any
orientación de
guidance,
carácter
guidelines,
internacional
regulations at the
que, bueno,
international level
regule este
that
tipo de
govern
comités? Y
the
si es así,
conduct and
¿cómo
the
se
makeup of these
incorporan estas
committees? If that's
regulaciones
the case,
internacionales en
how do
las
these international
regulaciones de los
regulations
países de Latinoamérica?
fit
Los países de
with
Latinoamérica
the Latin American
sobre ensayos
regulatory
clínicos nos dicen algo
frameworks?
sobre estos
Are the
comités de
regulatory
monitoreo de
frameworks in Latin
datos. Tal
America
vez esto
on
es más
clinical
para
trials, can they tell us
Patricia.
or reveal anything to us about this? This
Bueno,
question is for Patricia.
hay una
Well,
guía
there
de
are
la
guidelines.
Agencia
In fact,
Europea de Medicamentos.
the European Agency for
También
Medicines has
hay,
guidelines, and we also have
pero ya más antigua,
something
del
even
2002,
earlier from 2002,
creo que es perdón, del 2005, una guía
from
de la Organización
2005.
Mundial de la Salud.
The WHO
Y hay
has
un
a
borrador
guide. There's also a draft
de
document
la FDA.
from
En
the
todo
FDA
caso, yo después voy a
in
poner
this
en el chat estos
area.
tres
So I'm going to
documentos.
upload
Muchas
all these
regulaciones de
documents
países
onto the chat. Many
latinoamericanos
countries'
hablan del
regulations
comité de monitoreo de datos.
have
Por ahí
a
no tienen una guía
DMC.
específica de
There's
en
no
qué casos
specific
tenerlo.
guidelines.
Algunas hacen mención
Some do
a una
mention,
serie
however, they
de
mention a
características de
series
estudio en
of
donde tiene que haber comité de
specific
monitoreo de
types of
datos
studies
obligatoriamente,
where it's required
pero
by
no tienen
law
una guía
to have
específica como estas que
DMCs
les estoy
involved, but they don't
mostrando.
have specific
Entonces,
guidelines like the ones
yo
that
ahora
are
voy a
being
poner en
referred to
el
here.
chat
I'm going to upload onto the
tres
chat
referencias para
the
que ustedes
3
puedan
reference documents that
revisarlas.
you can
Una,
review.
teniendo en cuenta que es un
One of
borrador
them,
que está para
I want to
comentarios
just reiterate,
generales.
is a draft document.
Gracias, Patricia. No sé si
Thank
Sima,
you,
¿quieres
Patricia.
agregar algo a
I
esa
don't know if you'd
pregunta?
like to add anything to that, Seema.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, that there are these international documents that provide some guidance. And they provide some guidance about when DMCs should be used. However, DMCs are increasingly being used beyond that. So there are, a researcher or sponsor can decide that it's important to use a DMC in a situation that goes beyond what the guidance says. And I think the National Institutes of Health is one sponsor that is increasingly requiring DMCs for particular trials. Some people think even beyond when they should be used. So that is one, I think, challenge, figuring out exactly when it is appropriate to use these data monitoring committees and when it might be reasonable to use another approach to monitoring safety of a clinical trial or monitoring other features of the trial as it's ongoing.
Gracias, Sima, por la especificación. Y una pregunta que se relaciona
Thank you very much for
con
that
esto que acabas de decir
specification.
antes de pasar a
Now,
otra,
when we're
es
talking,
¿por
before
qué
we
es
move on to
tan
the next question,
importante
I'd
saber
also like to
cuándo
ask, why is
es
it so
que
important to know
necesitamos
when
usar o
we
tener
need
DMCs,
to resort
los
to the use
comités de
of
monitoreo de datos
the data monitoring committees
en la conducción de ensayos clínicos?
in
¿Por qué
carrying out
debemos preocuparnos
clinical
por eso?
trials?
A ver, los comités de monitoreo de
Okay,
datos,
so
o sea, un estudio clínico
a clinical trial
implica diferentes tipos de supervisiones, ¿está bien?
requires
Que
different
fueron
levels
nombradas
of like
en
oversight
ambas
or monitoring,
exposiciones.
and
Entonces,
both of us presenters
en
refer
este
to that.
caso,
In this
el
case,
rol primario del monitoreo,
the
del comité de
primary
monitoreo de datos es un
role
rol
of
único,
the
porque
DMC
tiene
is
acceso
unique
a los datos
because
de
DMCs
seguridad y
have
eficacia, los
access
datos
to safety
acumulados
and
durante el
efficacy
estudio,
data that were
pero en forma
aggregated throughout the
no
study
ciega.
but
Entonces,
in an
es un
in an
comité que
unblinded
puede
way. So
recomendar cosas
this is
que
a committee
obviamente
that is
no
in a
van a
position
poder
to
recomendar o
recommend
hacer los
things
otros comités,
that
¿verdad?
other committees may not be in a
Entonces, es
position to recommend
fundamental
or act upon.
en términos
So
de
they are
el balance entre los
key
beneficios
in
y riesgos del
terms
estudio, en lo
of
que hace a la
striking that
continuidad, en lo que hace a la
cost
necesidad de
risk-benefit
modificaciones
analysis
y
in
en
the
lo que
study
hace
in
a
terms
no
of
repetir
need
riesgos
and
que van
not
surgiendo.
repeating
Por eso
the
es muy
same risks
importante el
that
comité de
may have come
monitoreo de
about.
datos.
And that is why
Por
DMCs
ahí
are so
yo vi
important.
un comentario con
I
respecto a la
saw a
calidad. Hay
comment
diferentes
on
comités
quality,
que
and let
supervisan
me
el estudio.
say that there are
Entonces ya
different
dijimos que el
committees
steering
that
committee o el comité
oversee the
ejecutivo
study. So
tiene
we
un
already
rol
said that
no solo en
the
la redacción del
steering
informe,
committee or
pero
SC
sí
plays a
en
role
otras
in
cuestiones con
drafting
respecto a
the
revisar,
report,
por
but
ejemplo,
also
si hay,
other
si
aspects
no
that
se
have
está
to do, for
alcanzando los
example,
puntos
with
finales,
reviewing
cómo se está
whether or not the
conduciendo y demás.
endpoints are being
La
achieved, how
calidad
the study is being
de
conducted,
los
etc.
datos, la integridad del dato,
Data
tiene que
quality
ver
and
con el
data
monitoreo del
integrity
estudio,
has
que
to
es
do
una de
with
las funciones
monitoring the study, which is
obligatorias
one of
de
the
los patrocinadores que
mandatory
monitorean que
role
cada
that
dato que surja del
sponsors
estudio
do. That is to
sea
say
un
that
dato
all
íntegro.
data
No es
coming
una
from the
tarea
study are,
específica
you
del
know,
comité de monitoreo de datos.
have integrity.
Después está el comité, ya dijimos,
And
de
then
adjudicación de eventos,
we
que
have
ve
the
que,
event
ojo, estás
adjudication
tomando este
committee.
evento, pero este
So you say,
evento
okay, you're
que te
taking a
estás
look at this
tomando es un
event,
evento que
but
realmente
this
está
event
armonizado con lo que se
is
considera punto final, porque si no estamos
harmonized with what
considerando
is
diferentes
considered
puntos finales para
an
un mismo
endpoint,
estudio,
because
se
otherwise we're
homogeniza
considering
los
different
puntos finales del
endpoints
estudio.
for
Pero el comité de
the
monitoreo
same
de datos
study.
tiene algo que
But
ninguno de
the
esos tres
DMC has
comités
something that
tiene,
neither of those three
que
committees
es la cuestión
has.
de que tienen
None of those committees
abiertos
have,
los
and
ciegos
that
para
is that
analizar
they
justamente los
are
datos
able to
acumulados en
analyze
términos de
the
la
data
seguridad, en
that
términos de la
was
eficacia.
aggregated in
Después
terms
se
of
toca con
safety and
algunos puntos que yo
efficacy.
dije. Por
And
ejemplo,
then
si ve que no se están
going back to what
alcanzando
I
los
said, for
eventos,
example, if we
puede
see that the events
tener una
are
reunión con el
not
steering
met,
committee
they
y
may
decirle,
have a
señores, no
meeting
se
with the
están
steering
alcanzando
committee and
los
say,
eventos que son
look,
puntos finales del
we are
estudio,
not
tal vez se
getting the
requiera
events that
una
are endpoints
modificación
for
en
the
este
study, so
sentido, o sea,
we may need
recomendar
to make
distintas
changes.
cuestiones, puede recomendar
And so they
una
may
gama. Por
recommend
ejemplo, en un
different
estudio
things. For
adaptativo,
example,
el
in an
comité de
adaptive
monitoreo de
study,
datos puede ver
the
que se
data
necesita una
monitoring committee may
adaptación
see that
de un
there's a need
punto
to change
un punto del estudio, por ejemplo,
something in the
modificar una
study, for
rama,
example, to
pero no es
change
el que
one of the branches,
modifica.
but
Para eso
they
hay
are
un
not the
comité de
ones making the
adaptación,
changes. That's what
Generalmente,
the
los
other
estudios
committee, the
adaptativos
adaptation
tienen un comité de adaptación
committee
que es el que
does.
modifica
So
hacia la
there's a
recomendación,
committee
pero
that
no es
makes
el que
that
recomienda
change
a su vez.
following
Uno
the
recomienda,
recommendation.
otro
So
modifica.
one committee
¿Se
recommends,
entendió esto?
another one implements
El
the
rol es
recommendation.
fundamental porque
Is it clear?
es único,
It plays
tiene abierto
a
los
key
ciegos,
role because
con todo lo que esto implica.
they have access
Gracias,
to the
Patricia.
blinded
Sima, ¿tú
data.
quieres agregar algo a esa
Sima,
pregunta?
would you like to add anything to this?
Yes, I think that was very comprehensive. So maybe I'll just very briefly say there's some practical considerations here because it takes resources to create an independent committee of experts and make sure that they have the experience necessary to serve in this role. And it takes time to do that. So in many cases, the question is it more important to have this external committee that you need to set up, or can you do this with a committee that is mostly comprised of people from inside the study who are already monitoring it and sort of take a more careful look at safety events and issues as they arise? There's obviously something tremendous that's added by having an external data monitoring committee, but it's not practical for all studies and not necessary for all studies. I think also for studies where there isn't, where participants aren't being randomized or they're not being blinded, then it may be less important to include data monitoring committees. But even then, there may be some cases where they are useful. And finally, I think, as you were hearing from Dr. Saidan, there are lots of different groups involved. And so part of the question is really, is this the best use of all of these resources, or can we use existing infrastructure to make sure that a trial is being conducted ethically and that participants are being protected.
Gracias. Ahora vamos a ir entrando
you.
un poco a esta relación entre
Now we're
los
going to
comités de
talk more
ética
about
y
the
los,
relationship between
comités de
ethics
monitoreo de
committees
datos.
and
Y
DMCs.
una pregunta
And in that sense,
que hay en el chat es
there's
si
a
es
question
que
on the chat, and that
el rol
is
que tienen los
whether
comités de
the
monitoreo de
role
datos
that
pueden
DMCs play
asumirlos un comité,
may
porque es un comité de ética,
be
deben
played
decir así.
by an IRB.
¿Por qué sí? ¿Por qué no?
Why or why not?
Patricia, Sima, ¿quién? Ajá, Sima.
Patricia
Go
or
ahead.
Sima, whoever's ready.
I'm happy to take the first chance at answering this. This is something that came up a lot in some of our discussions. Why do you need a data monitoring committee when there already are ethics committees? Now, one key component of data monitoring committees is that they, as you heard from Dr. Saigon, they have very specific expertise where they understand the disease that's being studied. They have a lot of knowledge of other trials that are ongoing. They're really keeping up to date on all of that information so they can rapidly look at data and make a determination about how much continuing the study will add to what is known or whether that's not really necessary to continue trials. And ethics committees simply could not have that kind of expertise. They can consult with others sometimes for the review of trials, but there's so much that they have to do and so many different kinds of trials that they have to oversee. It wouldn't be practical for ethics committees to take such a close look at data and make determinations in the same way as a data monitoring committee. At the same time, the question really is, there is an important question about whether you need that extra firepower from the data monitoring committee or whether it's enough that there is an ethics committee overseeing a trial and the other bodies that are also overseeing it. So I think when you have a randomized controlled trial that contains serious endpoints and maybe a vulnerable population where it's really, really important for somebody to be looking at the unblinded data and making sure that the trial continues to provide value and is stopped the minute that it doesn't, or that there's some serious safety concern that really outweighs any potential new knowledge that could come from that trial, then it's really critical that you have a data monitoring committee in place to help with that determination.
Gracias, Sima. Patricia, ¿tú quieres agregar algo?
Thank you, Sima. Patricia, is there anything you would like to add?
Estás en mute.
You're muted.
Quería agregar que
I wanted to add
básicamente entiendo que
that basically
siendo la investigación clínica
I
una
understand that
actividad tan compleja,
given that
debemos
clinical
asegurarnos
research is such a complex
sobre
activity,
todo
we
en los
need to
estudios
make
que
sure
comenté,
that
en
especially
estudios que,
in
por
studies
ejemplo,
like the ones
mortalidad
I described
elevada o
before, for
fases
example, with
tempranas,
high morbidity
tengamos
or
diferentes
mortality
comités con
or early
diferentes
stage,
tareas,
we have different committees
que a
performing
veces se
different
tocan, pero
roles.
la mayoría de las
Sometimes
veces
there
no.
may be
El
overlap,
comité de
but the
monitoreo de
majority
datos,
of the
como
times
dije,
there's not.
el
The
comité de
DMC,
ética no podría
the ethics committee
ver rápidamente
could
la
not
futilidad del
very
estudio porque
quickly
no tiene abiertos los
see
ciegos.
or speak on the
Podría tener
futility
abiertos los ciegos,
of the study because they're
podría
not
tenerlos,
open to
pero
the
afectaría la
blinded
integridad
data.
del
They could,
estudio,
but that
a
would
su vez,
compromise the
¿está bien?
integrity of the study,
Entonces,
right? So,
hay, en mi juicio hay diferentes comités
in
que
my
tienen diferentes
opinion, there
tareas
are different
que a
committees
veces se
playing
tocan
different roles
en
that, like I
algunos
said,
puntos,
overlap
pero
sometimes in
particularmente
some
tienen un
areas,
rol
but
consolidado
they
en un punto
they
fundamental. En este
play
punto
a very
fundamental, que
unique
es poder
role
recomendar
in one special
rápidamente
thing, which is to
al
be able to make
patrocinador
quick recommendations to the sponsor
que siga un estudio, que se
to
modifique
continue
rápidamente
study or to
o que
make quick
termine un
changes
estudio,
or to terminate a
entonces ahí
study.
tiene un rol único,
And
que no
that
creo
role is
pueda
unique
cumplir
that I do not
ningún otro
believe
comité.
any other committee may play.
Gracias.
Thank
Patricia.
you, Patricia.
Hay varias preguntas
Well,
sobre
there
esta
are
relación
several
entre el
questions
patrocinador y
about
el
this relationship between the
Comité de Monitoreo de
sponsor
Datos.
and the
La
DMC.
primera tal vez está
The first one
relacionado más a los conflictos de interés, ¿no?
relates more
¿Es el
to like
patrocinador
conflicts
quien
of interest.
elige
Is the
a los
sponsor the
miembros
one
del
that
Comité de
picks
Monitoreo de
the
Datos?
DMC members?
Y además el patrocinador
And
paga
also,
a los miembros
because
del
the sponsor
Comité
also
de Monitoreo de
pays
Datos. ¿Esto no es acaso
the DMC
una
members.
situación de conflicto de
So
interés
isn't this
evidente? ¿Cómo
an
asegurar
evident
que
conflict
la
of interest
transparencia,
situation? How
imparcialidad
do we
de los
ensure the
miembros del Comité
transparency
de
and
Monitoreo de Datos?
unbiased work of the DMC members?
Yo no sé si Sima quiere contestar
I don't know if
esto
Sima
primero
would
o
like to
prefiere
go
que yo
first
haga.
or you would like me to go first.
Happy to have you go first. Unless you would
Sí.
like me to.
Como usted quiera. No,
Your
a
call.
ver, yo
Anyway,
muy corto para dejarle lugar a
very
Sima en esta
briefly so that
pregunta.
Sima can also answer this question.
El producto es del patrocinador.
The
Como
product
tal, él tiene
belongs to the
obligaciones.
sponsor. Therefore, the sponsor has certain
Digamos,
obligations.
estudiar el
For
perfil de
example,
su
to
producto durante todo
study
el
the
desarrollo en
profile of
términos
its
de la
product throughout the
seguridad y
entire
de la
development
eficacia,
process in
de
terms of
planificar los
safety
trials,
and
los
efficacy,
estudios
to
que
plan
tiene que
the
realizar
trials
para responder
that
a
they need
diferentes
to
preguntas
perform to
y que al
answer
final
different
haya un producto
questions
eficaz y seguro.
so that we can make
En
sure that
términos
there
de eso,
is
tiene la
a
obligación de
product that
constituir un
is
comité. El rol de las
safe,
autoridades
and therefore
sanitarias
they
no es
must
elegir al
have
comité,
a
es
committee. Health
regular
authorities should
cómo debe
not
funcionar,
put together the
cómo
committee,
debe
but
componerse,
rather
qué responsabilidades
regulate
tiene
how
ese
it needs
comité.
to be
Por
made
eso les
up
agregué la
and what
obligación.
roles they need to perform.
Surge
That's why I added
después
the
que
guidelines there.
una de las cosas que se regulan
And this happened
es que los
because
comités tienen que
one
tener
of the things
procedimientos
that
de
must be
conflicto de
regulated is
interés.
to make sure that
Y esto
committees
va a estar
have
en los
a
procedimientos de
conflict of
conflicto de
interest
interés. Y ahora dejo
resolution
lugar
procedure.
a Sima
And with that,
para
I would like to
su
give the
segunda.
floor to Sima so she can speak to this.
Yeah, this is a really important question. So to add, I think first, it is true that DMCs receive an honorarium for each meeting. For data monitoring committees that are run by the National Institutes of Health in the United States, this is really a modest sum that doesn't completely compensate for the amount of time that the role takes. So there, I think there's very limited conflict of interest that arises as a result of the honorarium. For pharmaceutical companies, it's very unclear how much they pay. I've never served on a DMC for a pharmaceutical company, but in talking to people who have, it sounds like they're compensated quite well. So it's possible that that compensation could be something that leads to more of a conflict of interest. I think one key aspect of data monitoring committees is people are chosen to serve on them based on having a lot of expertise and knowledge in the area. And so there is some level, I think, of integrity that people bring to doing this work, and some sense that they really should try to do the work well and not be pressured by the sponsor and what they would like to see. I think one challenge, however, is that data monitoring committees make recommendations to the sponsor and typically do not have much recourse if the sponsor doesn't follow their recommendations. So that, I think, is perhaps a bigger challenge for data monitoring committees to be fully independent. There have been a few high-profile situations where data monitoring committees have said publicly that they didn't agree with the interpretation of data that a sponsor released. This happened during the COVID pandemic, for instance, and then a case where one data monitoring committee in France resigned, where all of the members quit because they felt that what was happening was not consistent with the integrity of the trial and the information that was being shared was not accurate. So this is, I think, a challenge of where, you know, many good people might come into this role, have a lot of expertise, want to do it well, and yet have a limited ability to ensure that their recommendations are followed. That said, I think, you know, it is true, as Dr. Saidon said, that the sponsor does have a lot of responsibility to move the product forward, has to present those data to a regulatory authority, and there can be certain checks on the system that can help with the independence of the DMC. So that could include a research ethics committee looking at who's on the data monitoring committee, making sure that they have the relevant expertise to do the work. And also the regulatory authorities in a country, when they're considering whether to approve a particular product, being able to look at the data monitoring committee's reports and decisions along the way to ensure that approval is appropriate.
Gracias, Sima, por la respuesta.
Thank you,
Hay una
Sima,
pregunta
for
muy
that
específica
answer. Now we have a
sobre
very
los
specific
miembros
question
de estos
about
comités. Y si es que
committee
estos
members,
miembros, ¿no? Los
and
miembros
that
del
is
Comité de Protección
whether
de Datos, pueden
CMD,
ser autores
DMC,
de la
members
publicación
may
que
be
resulta del
authors
estudio.
of the publication coming off as a result of the study.
Yeah, if I might take this one, I think this is a good question because this came up in our interviews of data monitoring committee members. So in the past, it was the case that members of data monitoring committees would serve as authors. And then it was realized that this is a direct conflict of interest, particularly if you have a publication that will come out in a high-profile journal that's of great value to someone for their promotion. So this is a practice that was done in the past, but is no longer recommended.
Gracias, Sima. Patricia,
Y
¿quieres
solo para
agregar algo?
agregar que las guías
Just to
recientes de
supplement that the
la
recent
Agencia
guidelines
Europea
from the
y el
European
borrador de
Medicines
FDA
Agency and the FDA draft
determinan conflicto de interés no solo por aspectos
say that there's
financieros, sino
conflict
por
of interest
autoría
not
también.
only
O
for
sea que
financial
también hay
reasons
una
but
recomendación
authorship as well.
regulatoria
So there is a
que no
regulatory
sean
recommendation in this regard that members not be authors.
Por las respuestas.
Thank you for
Tal
your
vez un par
answers.
de preguntas
And
más.
now maybe a few more
Una
questions.
es sobre,
One of them
los miembros
has to
también,
do
del
again with the
DMC.
DMC
Hemos,
members.
Sima ha presentado estas
Sima
consideraciones éticas
talked
que,
about the
los
ethical
DMCs
considerations
deberían
that
tener en
DMC
cuenta. Y esto
members
quiere
should
decir que
take into account.
necesitamos a eticistas,
And this
bioeticistas
means
en
that
los
we need
DMCs.
ethicists. And
Dice
does
también
this mean
algunas,
that ethicists and
respuestas
bioethicists
desde
are
Sima,
needed in
ciertos
DMCs?
miembros,
This is based on the
sobre esto. ¿O es
questions
que debe
that we
exigirse
received.
algún
Or
nivel de
should we
conocimiento
require some
en
level
ética
of
de los
knowledge
miembros?
about ethics among members?
Algunas ideas sobre ese tema.
Thoughts on this?
I think I might start here, and I'm curious also for your thoughts, Patricia. But so in general, I think ethicists can bring a lot of value to data monitoring committees. One challenge as an ethicist myself that I have seen is sometimes if you don't fully understand the science and the clinical picture of the trial that you're involved with, it may be very difficult for you to serve in this role in a meaningful way. So I have served on some data monitoring committees where I don't know a lot about the science, and I felt that I haven't contributed very much at all. And others where I know much more and I'm able to, collaborate with others to provide what I hope is useful guidance. In general, I think we heard from people that there are certain kinds of trials where it's more important to have an ethicist. And I think some of this Dr. Saidon talked about as well, the idea where you might have a trial that has higher risks involved, where the participants are from groups that are vulnerable to harm or exploitation. If there's some challenge, if it's really difficult to know whether the trial should go forward. So some trials are done, particularly because there's a concern about changing how clinical practice works, but there are very strong views in the clinical community about the different interventions. And so it's very hard to know when to stop a trial early, when the results will be sufficient to change people's minds. And that can be very contentious and has led to a lot of challenges. So there are times where I think it's more likely that ethical issues will come up that are difficult to resolve. And then it can be very useful for an ethicist to be there on a data monitoring committee, because then they really understand what's at stake and they've been there all along to have conversations with others. One participant from our trial was talking about a situation in early HIV treatment trials when there were not available treatments for people living with HIV. And they said that, it was so important that if you were a fly on the wall in that room, they said you couldn't tell who was the ethicist, who was the clinician, who was the statistician, because everybody was really on the same page and they understood, they're really working together to figure out what to do. So I think in cases like those, ethicists are really critical. In other cases, it may be possible to consult a research ethics consultation service. One challenge from that is that DMCs do need to keep things confidential and often sign agreements saying they won't share information with others. But I think if you could get permission to talk to a research ethics consultation service, there may be cases where that's sufficient to address ethical issues. And then finally, with the person asking the question suggested is also a good idea. And something we're really interested in thinking about further, which is how can you develop ethics training to help people when they join DMCs really be able to think through these issues, even if they aren't formally trained in ethics.
Gracias, Sima. Patricia, ¿tú quieres agregar algo sobre eso?
Thank you, Sima. Anything else you would like to
Mucho, o sea,
add?
lo que sí es que,
Not much.
si la intervención del
But
CMD
if the
es en un
DMC
estudio de alto
intervention
riesgo que
is
va
in a high-risk
significar la
study
toma de
that
decisiones,
will
de antemano
mean
conocemos que esta
taking
intervención
decisions,
es
making
de muy
decisions
alto riesgo y va
beforehand,
a implicar la posible
and
recomendaciones
it may
hacia
imply
una pronta
having
terminación,
recommendation
hacia
towards early
cambios
termination
significativos en el
or
estudio. Yo
significant
creo
changes
que
in
el
the
miembro
study. I
eticista
believe that the ethicist, as a
debe
member,
considerarse
must
desde
be
el inicio.
considered
No sé si en todos
as
los
from the very
estudios,
beginning.
pero
I don't know if for all
es
studies,
una
but
buena práctica
I think it's
en
just a
determinados
good
estudios.
practice for these types of studies.
Gracias. Finalmente,
Thank you.
y creo que con esto ya vamos
Finally,
a
and I
terminar,
believe that with this
hay
we'll
preguntas sobre,
finish. We have
los
some
procedimientos,
questions
la
about
organización
procedures
de
and
los
the
comités de
organization
monitoreo de
of
datos.
these
El
DMCs.
primero está relacionado con
The
la
first one has to
documentación,
do
¿no?
with documentation.
¿Qué documento es
So,
clave
what
para,
documents are key
para estos comités que el
for
patrocinador
these committees
debería tener en cuenta,
for the sponsor
conservar,
to take
¿no?
into account in terms of keeping?
El patrocinador tiene que conservar
The
todos los
sponsor
documentos
must
del comité de
keep
monitoreo
all
de datos.
documents
El comité de
from
monitoreo de
the
datos debe
DMC. The
mantener todos los
DMC
documentos de
must
sus
keep
reuniones, de
all
sus actas, de sus
documents from
decisiones, de
their
sus calificaciones,
meetings, minutes, decisions,
eso lo debe
ratings,
mantener.
etc.
Después,
The sponsor must
el
keep all this.
comité, el
Also,
patrocinador,
the
cuando recibe las
sponsor, upon
recomendaciones, tiene que
receiving the
diseminarlas.
recommendations,
No se las queda
the
él
sponsor
para tomar
must
una
disseminate them.
determinación.
They cannot keep them to
Entonces,
make a
las debe
decision.
diseminar a los
So they
investigadores,
must
los
disseminate
investigadores a los
to
comités de
researchers,
ética,
and then
y el
researchers disseminate them to the
patrocinador
ethics
también la debe
committee,
diseminar
and the
al
sponsor should also
ente
disseminate them
regulatorio.
to the
De esta
regulatory
manera,
agency.
las decisiones
This
del
way,
comité,
the
las cartas
decisions
del comité con
made
sus
by the
recomendaciones tienen que llegar
committee or
absolutamente todos los
must be
investigadores,
in the
los
hands
comités de
of
ética que
all
aprobaron el
researchers,
estudio y
the
las
research
agencias
ethics that approve the
regulatorias que también.
studies, and like I said, the
Pero los
relevant
documentos del comité,
regulatory
todos deben
authorities.
estar
But the
guardados
committee
y se
must
deben
keep
mantener,
all
inclusive las
documents, and even including, like I said, the minutes of their meetings.
Gracias, Patricia. Tal vez
Thank
quieras
you,
decir algo
Patricia.
sobre
I don't know if you want to talk about the charter, the founding charter about DMCs and why they are important. They are also shared broadly. So I don't know if you want to speak about this. Well, some statutes in Latin America, like I already said,
tienen en sus normas
have as part of their
la
rules
necesidad de un comité de monitoreo de
the need
datos.
to have a DMC,
Algunas hasta definen en qué
and
caso
some
de
of them
estudios,
even
aunque como yo
specify
dije,
for what
las
kinds of
normas en
studies.
Latinoamérica
Although,
no
like I
cambian
said, the rules
tan
or the statutes
rápidamente
in Latin America do
y
not
los
change
comités
very
fueron
quickly,
aumentando su
and
participación
committees
en
have
investigación clínica.
expanded
Por eso
their
no
role
recomiendo
in clinical trials,
poner
and
en
that
la
is
norma
why
sí la
I
necesidad
do not
de que haya un
recommend
comité
including
en determinados estudios, pero no
I mean, to have the
establezcan
recommendation to have
claramente en la
committees in
norma,
certain types of
cuánto,
studies, but not
en qué
necessarily
tipo de
specify
estudios. ¿Por
in
qué?
the rule for
Porque como
what
ustedes
kind of
vieron,
studies.
no era lo
Why?
mismo en
Because, like you
1990 que en el
saw,
2006
it
que
wasn't the
ahora,
same
que por
to talk
ejemplo
about
hay
this in
estudios
1990,
adaptativos,
2006,
muchísimos
and
estudios
now we have a
adaptativos, si
lot
no
of
te van a
adaptive
requerir de
studies, and a
este
lot of
tipo
them
de
will
comité.
require these types of
Pero
committees.
tienen
But
eso y solicitan que se
they
les dé el listado de
are asked to be
miembros
given the
de los
list
comités de
of
monitoreo
members
de
that are
datos
part of
al
the DMC,
patrocinador
and to have
antes de
this
evaluar,
list
o sea,
delivered to
cuando
the
están
sponsor
evaluando es parte de la
when
documentación que el
doing
patrocinador debe otorgar a alguna de
their work. That's part of the
las
information that the
agencias regulatorias.
sponsor must submit to the regulatory agencies.
If I might add to that, so I think one interesting thing about data monitoring committees is that much of what happens is very internal and not shared broadly with others. And in particular, there's often a document called a charter that the sponsor will draft. And this document will say what the data monitoring committee is supposed to do for a given trial, what data they should access. It might say, how many meetings or how often they meet, and whether those meetings are closed or open. So it provides a lot of detail about what DMCs should do. Some people in our interviews described it as the Bible of what should be done in the trial, that you go back to it time and again when you're making decisions as a data monitoring committee member. However, charters are not typically made public. And there are model charters, examples that are developed by certain sponsors, but the ones for a particular trial can sometimes contain information that is considered proprietary or sensitive. But even with that, it still could be possible that charters are made more public than they are, with maybe some information redacted. So it is, I think, one interesting thing that a charter is a very important document, and there have been calls to make those documents publicly available, for example, on clinicaltrials.gov, but that hasn't really happened yet. So that's, I think, one critical document for data monitoring committees. I do think a list of members is also important, and it would be helpful if research ethics committees could review that. So that's something research ethics committees could ask to do if it's not provided to them. And maybe the last important document is the statistical analysis plan that the data monitoring committee has, and that will often have information about whether there are stopping boundaries that allow the DMC to stop trial early for safety or efficacy or futility. So those are some of the documents that are really important. And I think one challenge about data monitoring committees is that many of those documents are not publicly available, and we'd all be better off if they were, I think.
Gracias. Gracias por las respuestas. Un par de preguntas
Thank you for
más.
those responses. We have a couple more
Es
questions.
clave la calidad de los datos
So we're
en un
clear
ensayo.
on the quality
¿Cuál
of
es el
data
rol
in
que tienen los
these
comités
trials. So what's the role
de
played
monitoreo de datos sobre
by
este
the
aspecto, sobre
data
la calidad de los
monitoring
datos, la
committees in that
trazabilidad,
area in terms
el
of the
manejo de los datos de
traceability
investigación?
and the quality of data?
No, como yo comenté,
Well, as I
esta no es
indicated
una
earlier,
tarea que puedan hacer los
this
comités de
is
monitoreo
not
de datos,
a task that's
porque
up to
el comité
the
de monitoreo de
DMCs.
datos
because the
reúna a
DMCs
espacios
meet
prefijados, ¿está
in
bien? En cambio,
established
cada dato
spaces,
que
whereas
surge de la
each
investigación
data that
clínica,
comes out of the
cada
clinical
dato que se pone
research, all the data
de un dato fuente, ¿está
from
bien?
a
Ya sea la historia
source
clínica, un
with a
protocolo de
clinical
laboratorio,
history,
un protocolo
laboratory
de radiología,
protocols,
etcétera.
radiology protocols,
Es el dato
etc.
fuente que va
So these are
al
the
cuadernillo
source data
de recolección de datos o
that
CRF, como
is
ustedes
in a part of the data collection process,
conocen también.
as we all are
Tiene que
familiar
haber
with.
un monitor
There
que vea
needs to be
que
a
ese
monitor
dato
that determines
que fue
whether
al CRF de ese dato
data
fuente
that
sea íntegro, es
that
decir, que
it has to
sea un
be
dato que sea
data that
contemporáneo a cuando se
is
hizo, que
contemporary
tenga
with from the time it
un
was
autor, o
done, that it
sea,
has to have a
que haya
clearly
sido
identified
consignado por la persona que lo hizo,
author. In other
que
words,
sea
attributed
original,
to the author. It has
que
to
sea
be
un dato que no
original
se
data.
cambió, o sea,
This
tiene que
is data
tener
that's not been
determinadas
altered in any way or
características
modified. It has to
que
share
lo
all of
hagan
these
un dato íntegro,
characteristics
un
that
dato
will make
que
it
realmente
into
existe,
complete,
un
thorough
dato
data that exists, that
existe como se lo consignó. Esa es
that
tarea
exists as it was originally
del
developed.
control de
And
calidad que
so this is
hace el
part of the
monitoreo del
quality
estudio.
control
Para eso está el
process
monitor del
in
estudio.
the
De ninguna manera
monitoring
podría
process.
el comité de monitoreo de
The
datos que se reúna tiempos
DMC
prefijados para
that
ver
meets in a
aspectos
pre-established format and place
para hacer estas recomendaciones,
in
ver que
formulating these
todos los datos de
recommendations.
todos los
It's not up to
investigadores,
them
de
that all of
todos
the
los
data from
centros
all of the researchers,
tengan
from all of
esta
the sources,
calidad.
they're not
Eso
the
es
ones that
tarea,
determine
por eso
that
yo decía, la
quality, that
investigación clínica es una tarea
responsibility.
compleja,
So it's a very
cada uno
complex
tiene que hacer lo que
undertaking
tiene que
where
hacer
each
para que
actor has to play
finalmente
their role so
estemos
that
aprobando un
ultimately
producto que
you
realmente sea
are
eficaz y
formally
seguro. En
approving
este
a
caso,
product
la
that is
calidad del
effective
dato,
and
que ese
safe.
dato
So
sea
data
íntegro,
quality,
es un
to make
dato
sure that that's thorough,
del control del
it
aseguramiento de calidad y del control de calidad, o
includes,
sea,
it has to do with
del plan
quality
de gestión
control
de la
and
calidad
quality
que tiene el
assurance. You
patrocinador a través
have
del
to have a
monitoreo y la
quality
auditoría.
control
Y
plan
también,
and that follow up
obviamente, las
with auditing
autoridades regulatorias
efforts. So the
después hacen
regulatory
inspecciones para
authorities
ver, para
will then
controlar que
go
esos
over
datos con los cuales
specifications to make
están
sure that the
aprobando un
data
producto
that they're using for
que han
product approval
determinado por los
purposes
resultados que es
that were
eficaz y es
determined
seguro,
with
pero los
the
datos que dieron lugar a eso
results
sean
from the
datos
effective
que
and
realmente
safety
existen y
criteria. We have to
datos
make sure that the data
de
is
integridad.
actually
¿Está
there.
bien? O
In
sea
other words, you
que
have to
el
ensure the
monitoring,
integrity
la
of the
auditoría
data.
y la
So the
inspección de las
monitoring
autoridades
as well
regulatorias.
as regulatory authority inspection processes and procedures have to be in place.
Gracias,
Thank you,
Patricia. Ahora sí, para
Patricia.
terminar, o Sima, no sé
And
si
now,
tú quieres mencionar
just to
algo sobre, ¿no?
conclude, Seema,
Para
would you like to
terminar,
add anything? To
otra pregunta que
conclude,
tal vez es
I think we
básica y
have
va a
one
servir para
question, one more
reforzar lo que ya
question
hemos estado
that I think will help to
mencionando al inicio.
reinforce what we were
¿Quiénes
talking about
establecen
earlier.
los comités de
And it's
monitoreo de
basically
datos? ¿Son
who
solamente los
who
patrocinadores
establishes these
quienes lo hacen? Y si es así,
DMCs?
¿son
Is it
patrocinadores tanto
exclusive purview
privados
or responsibility
como
of the
públicos?
sponsors? And could there
Bueno,
be
ya
or should there
ustedes
be a
lo
public
responderán y tal vez no sé
entity?
si tengan
Should they
alguna
have
reflexión final
DMCs as
para
well?
pasar a Carla y poder cerrar
Just
este
for
seminario.
final
Muchas gracias.
comments, and I'll offer the floor later
Sí, son,
to
o
Carla as
sea,
well.
son los
Well,
patrocinadores, a
it's
veces
the
como comenté, los
sponsors,
steering
as I
committee o
indicated,
comités
the steering
ejecutivos.
committees
Pero,
that
a ver,
are involved, but
son de los
of the
patrocinadores
sponsors
de la industria farmacéutica, pero
in the
también de
pharmaceutical
institutos nacionales de
industry
salud,
and the
pero
National
también
Health
de asociaciones de
Institutes. They're
investigadores, o sea,
involved as well
no
as
tiene nada que
research
ver
associations,
que
and
sea
it
solo
doesn't,
para la industria
it's
farmacéutica.
not
Por
just
ejemplo,
exclusive to the
en
pharmaceutical
estudios
industry.
cooperativos
In,
cardiovasculares,
for example,
es
cardiovascular
muy común
cooperative
que el steering
studies and
committee sea el
research.
que
It's the steering
nombra a los
committee,
miembros
for
del
the
comité de
most part,
monitoreo
that
de datos, pero
appoints
comité de
the
monitoreo de
data
datos,
monitoring
teniendo
committee
en cuenta que
members.
son estudios de mortalidad elevada, tiene
If
que
we're
haber.
looking at high levels of mortality rates, then there has to have this in place.
Gracias, Patricia.
Thank you, Patricia.
Sima, ¿quieres añadir algo o tal vez
Seema, would
una
you like to
reflexión
add
final?
anything to this discussion?
Yes. So I think that's exactly right. And I would add that this is an important question that you can almost think about from a theoretical perspective. So some of the conversations we've had with people They will say, you know, why, if you were designing a system from scratch, would you create a system that has all of these different bodies, or where sponsors are essentially regulating themselves by creating data monitoring committees? Or would it be better to have something that's more external to them? And I think if we could start from scratch, you know, if we were living in an ideal world, it might be better to have data monitoring committees that were really truly independent of sponsors. But in the world we live in, I think we have to recognize how hard that would be to do, because sponsors are often doing this and setting it up for individual trials. And for so many trials, there's very particular expertise that is needed to have a data monitoring committee, that can really make it difficult to sort of have a standing data monitoring committee or some body that is much more like a research ethics committee, but maybe a little bit more specialized. With that said, I will say that the National Institutes of Health will sometimes appoint data monitoring committees for similar types of trials, where those committees will review many different trials altogether. And there's a lot of effort that goes into making sure that those people are as independent as possible and as qualified as possible. So for the COVID-19 vaccine trials, for the monoclonal antibody treatment and prevention trials, there were boards that were appointed by the NIH that oversaw many different trials that were conducted with both public and private sponsorship. So there are models that I think are more like what this questioner was suggesting, that are a little bit more in, you know, sort of taking the resources to create a DMC that has a lot of expertise, and having that DMC do work over a range of different trials. And I think increasingly we might see that model being used because it worked so well during the COVID pandemic.
Muchas gracias, Sima,
Thank you
Patricia,
very
Sara.
much,
Creo que ha sido
Seema,
y por supuesto todos
Patricia,
nuestros
Sarah,
participantes.
and all of our
Creo que ha sido
participants.
una
I
conversación
think
bastante
this
rica y que en
has been a
general
very
la
enriching
sesión
discussion,
de
and
alguna
I
manera es
think
como si
the
fuera un
session
abanico que nos
really
muestra que
reflects a
no
whole
solamente hay
umbrella
algunos
of
componentes del sistema en
components,
los que
components
muchas veces
where
sobre los que muchas veces no
of
reflexionamos,
which
sino que
frequently
además
we are not
este abanico no
providing
es algo
adequate
estructurado, sino que tiene
attention.
muchas áreas grises,
There are a
mucho
lot of great
potencial para
areas as
mejorar,
well, many
ah,
nuances and areas
pero,
for improvement,
pero bueno, tenemos que
but
partir por
we
analizar,
need to start
analizar qué hay y
with
pensar cuál es la
an
mejor manera de
analysis of
proceder.
what we
En
have and
general,
how
es
best to
interesante también
proceed.
reflexionar
It's also interesting to
que hay
reflect
una
on the fact
reflexión análoga
that we
que
have
se
this
está llevando no
analogous
en el área de investigación,
reflection, not so
sino
much
en el
in the
área de,
research
digamos,
arena,
ética de la salud
but
pública,
more in
en
the
la medida en que,
public health
y
ethics
creo que también
arena.
alentada bastante
And
por
I
la
think
experiencia de COVID,
this
nos
has
damos
been
cuenta
fostered greatly
que
and
hay una
encouraged
serie de
by the COVID
espacios en los que
experience. In other words,
normalmente
there's a whole series of
queremos
areas
resolver
or
personalmente de
spaces
datos o
where we think we're only
eficiencia o
working with
evidencia, y a la hora que
evidence and
miramos más de
data,
cerca,
and
vemos
yet
que lo que está en
sometimes
juego
we
son, por
find
ejemplo,
what's at
evaluaciones de
stake
riesgo-beneficio,
are, for
juicios
example,
de valor
risk
de todo
benefits
tipo que están
analyses or
subsumidos de manera
different
muy
judgment
discreta y
criteria that are under the
en distintos
surface
momentos de los
discreetly
procesos,
in
y
different
solamente a
points
la
in
hora
time within the
que los analizamos más
processes.
de cerca, nos
And
damos
those of us
cuenta
who
que
are
esos
looking
son
at this more
espacios donde
closely
lo que se está haciendo de alguna
realize
manera u otra es
that
trabajo en ética.
what we're
A
doing here
veces
is
los
looking
juicios
at
éticos son muy sencillos,
ethical
nadie necesita ir
issues.
con un bioeticista a hablar
Sometimes
con sus hijos
they're
sobre
very
dejaste, no
straightforward.
tendiste la cama o lo que
Sometimes
fuera, o hiciste esto mal.
ethicists
Hay muchas
will
situaciones en
consult
que
their
no hace
families, and
falta un análisis ético
sometimes we need
sofisticado,
to have
pero
a
muchas veces en que sí
sometimes we
hace
need a
falta. Y
sophisticated
creo que
ethicist,
esta
and other
discusión no
times I
solamente es
think it's more
importante
straightforward
en
than
el
that.
área de ética de la
So
investigación,
when we look at
sino para
ethics
la
in
bioética en
research, we
general y
need to look
para
at
lograr lo
in terms
que
of
desde el
bioethics and
Programa Regional de Bioética es
with the
nuestro
regional
mandato, que es integrar la
bioethics
ética
program. This is
en
our
todas las
mandate
áreas del trabajo en
consists
salud.
in really including ethics
Muchísimas
in
gracias a
every
todos, a
field
las
of health.
presentadoras,
So I want to
doctora
thank our
Shah, doctora
presenters. I
Saidón.
want to thank
Gracias
Dr.
también a todo el
Saidon
equipo del Programa
and
Regional de
Seema and
Bioética
Sara. I want to thank
y
the entire
de
PAHO
la
bioethics
Unidad de
team,
Calidad y Regulación de
as well
Medicamentos y
as
Tecnologías Sanitarias.
the
haces esto
health
posible.
technologies and
Y
medicines regulatory
también a
body,
nuestros intérpretes,
as
que
well
son
as to
nuestros
our
intérpretes que hacen posible
interpreters
que tengamos
who have
este
made
diálogo
this
en dos
discussion
idiomas.
in 2 languages possible.
Antes de cerrar
So
la sesión,
before
quiero
we conclude this
reiterar que la
session, I would just
grabación
like
será
to
compartida
reiterate
por medio de
that
nuestra
the
lista,
recordings of this
nuestra
discussion will
nuestra
be
lista de investigación ética.
available
Y por
to
esa misma
our groups,
lista
and
enviaremos
I will
la
send
información sobre el siguiente
all
seminario,
of the
que será
information
el
about
30
the
de agosto,
upcoming
sobre la
seminar, which will
revisión
be
de
held on
estudios
August
multicéntricos
30th.
y la
We'll be
política de
looking
revisión
at
ética única
the
de los Estados
unique
Unidos.
or single ethical
Muchísimas
review
gracias. Creo
process.
que vamos a
So I want to thank
compartir
you very
ahorita
much, and we're going
la
to
información para
share
los que no
all of
tuvieran el
the
acceso a la
information
website
for those
o
that
no tuvieran el
didn't get
acceso
access
a
to the
la,
website or haven't had
a las
access
listas para que
to the lists.
la tengan, pero
We want you to
la
have that
dejaremos así.
information, and we'll
La
post it.
dejaremos ahorita, ahorita mismo
We'll do
se
it right
las,
now, in fact.
comparto. Ahí está.
And
Y
here it is.
sin más,
So without
no tomamos más de su tiempo.
further
Muchísimas
introduction,
gracias y
we
que
want to
tengan
just
una buena tarde.
thank you very much and wish you a wonderful afternoon.